Hi everyone, my name is Aruni Kashyap and it's my pleasure to introduce you with Dr. Shastri Akella. He's a professor of English at Michigan State University and he lives there in East Lansing. He is here to read from The Sea Elephants, this beautiful book. I wanted to say a very few sort of words about Shastri and we will let Colin, how do you pronounce his name? I forget.
Colin, yeah.
Colin, Colin Scharf, right? Yeah. So Colin will introduce Shastri and his work in greater detail to all of you. Shastri has an MFA from University of Massachusetts at Amherst, where he also did his PhD in comparative literature, where he studied refugee art from 3 different communities, Tibetan, undocumented people in the United States and another community. And he has written this wonderful novel, which is published in 2 countries, United States and India. I wanted to show the India cover, but it is not available here with me today, but it's also a very beautiful cover. He has been a fellow at different kinds of residencies, such as the Fine Arts Work Center in Provincetown, Massachusetts. It is very widely published in places such as Guernica, Fairy Tale Review, the Masters Review, Electric Literature, Rampus, the World Literature Today. And he just told me today that one of his latest short story, which was published in the Fairy Tale Review, will be part of the Best American Essays 2024. Coming out in October, and none other than Lawrence Groff has chosen it personally, so amazing. But Colin, over to you. He's going to talk a little bit about The Sea Elephants and further introduce Shastri, but I'm so thankful all of you are here today.
Okay, hi. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this book, which I am really happy to be here to talk about today. I had the pleasure of reading Akella's chanting, and I might add, beautifully bound debut novel earlier this winter. A queer coming-of-age novel set in India from 1989 to 1997. The Sea Elephants reads not only like a step back in time, but also like a step between worlds. The novel's protagonist, Shagun, a young man we meet in his late teen years as he comes to terms with his sexuality and his culpability in the drowning deaths of his 2 younger sisters, interweaves his narrative with Hindu stories that he learned at his mother's knee. Later, after dropping out of a prestigious private boys' school to join, of all things, a traveling theater, Shagun performs these same stories to crowds of spectators and to curious readers. Like many coming-of-age novels, The Sea Elephants explores questions of love, loss, and independence. It's Shagun's queerness, which he struggles to express over the course of the book, as well as his desire for vindication in the wake of his sister's deaths, mark a deviation from the form. Abused in multiple ways at the boarding school and pursued by the operator of the Hanuman Male Fixing Center, Vikrant, a man whose drive to track down and fix queer men rivals the madness of Melville's Ahab. Shagun also wrestles with guilt, even as he acts out the roles of the very gods who might grant him forgiveness. In the midst of such chaos, and perhaps because of it, Shagun meets Mark, the ginger-haired, New York-born love of his life. Spellbinding and possessed of a witty humor that makes Shagun, despite his flaws, difficult not to like. I'm so scared, I think I might fart, Shagun tells his abusive, absentee father early in the novel, perhaps the first admission of this kind. The Sea Elephants is at its best when the worlds of men and myth converge. Myth, as one of Shagun's theater mentors tells him, is always told in the present tense. But it is not myth alone we read when Shagun, during his debut performance, assumes the role of the goddess Draupadi in the sea elephant myth and searches for her son. I'm going to read a quote from the book. Starfish twinkle as they circle his forehead. He laughs and claps as an octopus taps 8 corals, each producing a different note along the octave. A sea raga, a humpback and blue whale sing a duet in sea language. I move closer to my son to steal him, to bring him to the surface where the gods are waiting to give him back his mortal body. But the moment I touch his shoulder, I sense that my boy is not a boy, but a soul. and souls are beyond the confines of gender, so I refer to my child as they, not he. More than myth, these words are the stuff of magic. It is my pleasure to introduce Shastri Akella.
Thank you for inviting me here. It's really a pleasure to be here, and thank you, Colin, for that beautiful introduction. I also now don't have to provide a lot of contextual details for the sections I was planning on reading. So this is my debut novel, and so it's an interesting anecdote that I want to share before I read is I was not meant to be a writer, and this book was not meant to exist in its present form. I did my undergraduate in computer science and worked at Google for 5.5 years. And the desire to write fiction, this specific story, took me to the MFA program at UMass Amherst. And I wanted to work specifically with one professor, which is why I applied to that school, Sabina Marie. And so I took her workshop, and she read pages from my manuscript in her novel workshop. And Shagun, the main character in that draft, was asexual. And Mark, now his boyfriend, was his friend, which I feel like a lot of queer folk, before they come out, it's a narrative we can all relate to, right? So in her workshop, Sabina said, "This is dying to be a gay love story. Why aren't you letting it be one?" So I went into her office hours. I was very upset with her, and I said, "Why would you say that? He's asexual." And then she looked at me with the kindest pair of eyes, and she said, "It's okay for him to be gay. I'm sure he'll find friends in the community who will support him if he decides to be gay." And she pointed to specific elements in the story where it was clear that Shagun's desire for Mark was romantic in nature. And she called that the subtext of the novel. And over the course of my study of the craft of creative writing, I came across the Art of series that Grey Wolf Press put out. And the Art of Subtext by Charles Baxter was a very influential work of craft for me. And in that, Charles Baxter defines subtext as the element of the story that festers in the margins of the narrative until there is a point of conflict, there is a point of suffocation where it can no longer fester and it explodes to the surface. So when it explodes to the surface, that's when your key acts of violence, key acts of conflict happen at the narrative level. They no longer can be suppressed. And so for me, that was true of both the book I've written and my own experience. I think we all have experiences with conflict with our primary caregivers, and their acceptance comes at different levels. And so I'm going to start by talking about, by reading a section that's early on in the narrative. Just a heads up, there is some violence in this section, but I think a queer narrative specifically set in South Asia would be doing disservice to queer experiences if it does not bring the violence that we experience. So this is early on in the book where Shagun's just met his father who's come back home. There was a tropical depression in the Bay of Bengal. Rain, unseasonal, ruined our roads. I went to school, took my first final exam, and came back watchful of each step as I approached my house. The drainage overflowed, the one that ran by Ali's curb. It was a burbling black stream full of plastic bags, fish eyes, used diapers, drowned rats, and onion skins. I wondered if the road would clear by my next exam. Each final was separated from the next by a 2-day interval. When I got to my room, I saw some pictures on my bed, pictures of me squatting and peeing unnaturally bright. "Do you know why I took those pictures?" Pitaji asked. He was sitting at my study. "Because you're a sick bastard," I wanted to say. "Take these pictures to school," he said. "Ask a boy, a friend, what's wrong." He stressed on the word boy. He separated from the word friend by the length of a breath. He left the room then. As I changed into my night clothes, I imagined a man developing the film in his dark room. The studio man doesn't notice the images at first, not as they emerge in a tray of liquid hydroquinone, not when he strings them up on a clothesline, not when he brings them to the front desk and cuts them autopilot, each picture a perfect 5x7, ready to be inserted into photo albums. He distractedly eyes the images on top as he stuffs the lot into an envelope. The image registers in his head, but after a lag. He pulls the photos out to confirm, yes, they are pictures of a boy squatting on a hole. When Pitaji went to pick the photos up, did the studio man deliberate on the change to be returned, tapping one coin then another as he appraised Pitaji, wondering if he was a pedophile or if he received a monthly paycheck for photographing peeing boys? Did he try to see if the man before him resembled the boy whose image he had birthed in the lab? It continued to rain. Purple thunderbolts intermittently revealed the grey edges of swollen rain clouds. The power went out. I had to study for English. I lit a candle and went to the living room and turned Ma's radio on. It was story time with Amar Sethi. Princess Kunti, beautiful and young, is blessed with a chant she may use to invoke any god of her choice. Imagine that, the storyteller said. You look up at the heavens, point at a god, and say, that's who I want, like a spoiled child in a toy shop. With no particular desire in mind, with nothing but the knowledge of the chant and the youthful impatience to put it to test, she looks at the sun and invokes the sun god. And he appears before her, the god who illuminates the world. At that moment, the living room filled with electric purple. A deafening sound followed close on its heel. The window panes rattled in their frames. I squeezed my eyes shut. Then the steady drumbeat of rain returned. The curtains scrunched tightly against the windows, billowed again. I got up, candle in hand, walked to the window, pushed aside the curtain. In the window pane, my reflected lips parted, my reflected fist slackened. The candle slipped from my hand. The wick snuffed against the floor, released smoke and the smell of burned wax. A branch that was sawed off from the tree by the storm had made a hole in the roof of our treehouse. So the treehouse is the space that Shagun really uses to play with his sisters. It's their sort of their playtime location. So his sisters are gone and this treehouse is now destroyed, so it's hit him in a particular way. In the window, a little above me, a little to the right, appeared Pitaji's reflection, his candle giving him a hazy halo. He went back after a moment into Ma's room and closed the door. The radio storyteller continued his tale. I went into the prayer room and struck a match. Kunti spends a night with the sun god. I came out holding the alabaster statue of Hanuman in the crook of my arm. Kunti is impregnated with the sun's bastard. I marched up the stairs and flung the door open. It struck the wall and quivered. Pitaji, who was lying down with his head in Ma's lap, sat up. The two candles in the nightstand dimmed, then brightened. Ma frowned, confused. When her gaze slid from my frowning face to the deity's smiling one, she started. What's going on? Looking at my father, I said, I hope I never grew up to be like you. Kunti abandons her bastard boy by the banks of the Ganga, the storyteller said. My sisters, I said, were you their father as well? His face crumpled. I said, I get it. If you showed up right when they died, you'd have to be decent. 30 years later, Kunti's illegitimate son, fierce warrior, fine archer, is killed by her legitimate son. She casts his ashes into the currents of the Ganga. I smirked. But show up 6 months later, and you can get straight to bumping uglies. Ma said, from the way you're turning out, becoming your father doesn't seem to be a bad option. I said, did I say something wrong? Oh, my mistake. Maybe he's going at it so hard because he wants another kid to, replace the dead ones. And why are they dead, Shagun? Ma asked. What's wrong with you? My father exclaimed, looking at her angrily. I could tell from his reaction that she told him about the hand I had in my sister's death, but she'd promised she'd keep it. She promised me she'd keep it a secret. I raised the statue of Hanuman above my head and flung it down. My parents got to their feet as Hanuman exploded into 100 shards of painted alabaster. Ma ran to the ruined god. She sank to the floor, collected the piece, and turned it over. Kunti swims in the Ganga, her aged, sagging breast speckled with her son's ashes. My father charged towards me. Ma, still on the floor, leaned forward on her knees and extended her hand towards me. Go, Shagun, she said. Run, quickly. I pulled the door as I left the room, but not hard enough for it to close. Between the door and jamb, I saw her fingers wrapped around his ankle. I raced down the corridor. I was at the mouth of the staircase when I heard Ma's door whistle open and hit the wall. I watched Pitaji march towards me. My chest went tight. I stood frozen, enraptured by the crazed look that filled his face. Don't, Ma shouted, merging into the corridor. His heavy breathing reached me before he did. He raised both his hands as though asking me to stay away. His palms met my back, and he pushed. I tumbled down the stairs, my elbows, my forehead, my hips striking the edge of one tread then another. I landed on my stomach. I pressed my forearms to the floor and tried lifting myself. Blood dripped from my forehead but made no sound on the floor. My jaw hurt, my vision swam. I relinquished control to the oncoming tide of darkness. So that's from part one of the book, and to escape his father, who wants to fix his son and teach him the ways of masculinity, which is what this whole episode was about how a man is supposed to stand in pee and not squat in pee. Shagun leaves home and he goes to a boarding school, and he meets the worst place for a queer kid to be is an all-boys boarding school. I can tell that from first-hand experience of being at an all-boys boarding school. So he then flees the boarding school as well, and he wants to join a street theater troupe. But at first, the head of the street theater troupe rejects him, saying, "You don't come from a tradition of storytelling. Why should I take you in?" But there are two actors who see his passion and his love for stories, because that's what he grew up with, as Colin had mentioned in his introduction. So these two actors take Shagun under their wing and say, "We'll train you and we'll present you to our chief." And then it's his decision whether he accepts you or not. So I'm going to read a little bit from his training experience with one of the actors, Saya, who's also queer. Saya undertook the third phase of my training. He led me one morning into the woods. He wore a brick red sari over a white t-shirt, and his long hair was in a bun atop his head. "The art of dialogue is not words, but how your voice forms the words," he said, arcing his long neck, running his hand along it. "Your voice must reveal the emotional state of your character. The audience should cringe even if you cuss in the dark. Even when your voice is low, the person farthest from the stage must hear you." I asked, "How can the audience hear me when my voice is low?" "Hush," he said, and clutched my shoulder. He moved his face closer to mine. "Listen." I heard a low, blubbering voice that sounded almost human, but there was an untrained quality to it, something that made it belong to the habitat of the wild and not to a human throat. He raised his hand and pointed. Several feet to our right, an orange beak peeped from between banyan leaves. He whispered, "If that bird were on stage as its audience, you're far away, but you hear." The orange beak disappeared. The sound of flapping wings rose from between shivering leaves. The bird glided past us above the canopy. He said, "You will learn from the hornbill how your voice goes far even when it's low." I began imitating bird calls that day: the happy whistle of a thrush, the guttural hoot of an owl, the angry screech of a bat, the hungry caw of a crow, the mating call of a myna, the longing coo of a nightingale, the hornbill's contemplative whisper. "You're exercising your vocal cords with sounds of different kinds," Saya said. He made me drink a steaming hot juice of honey and beetroot to keep my voice from croaking. I went to bed each night with my fingers on my neck, feeling the tremors of the birds in my throat. During one of those practice sessions with Saya in the woods, as I mimicked after him the bird calls he gave me, we heard heavy footsteps crunching the bed of dry leaves. We looked towards the sound to identify its source, and from between the thin branches of a creeper that had formed a curtain between two tree barks, we saw the hazy form of Nandi, which is the theatre chief, as he made his way towards us. "We're so dead if he sees us," Saya exclaimed. He pushed me behind a thicket of wild passion flowers. Just stay there, he whispered. I'll come get you when the coast is clear. When Nandi was almost upon us, Saya took 3 big steps forward and crashed into Nandi, almost losing his balance. You scared me, Saya said. What are you doing here? Nandi asked. Saya released a bird call in response, a peacock. Nandi said, I heard that, but who were you doing it with? Saya looked around confused, scanning the empty wilderness. Then he snapped his fingers. Actually, I was mimicking a peacock and his peahen. Listen. He produced 2 shrill squawks of different registers. Enough with that now, Nandi said, covering his ears. I was so good you thought there were 2 of us? Saya said, clapping. Are you high? Nandi asked. I pressed a hand to my mouth to hold back my laughter. They turned and left. The sound of the departure was absorbed by the thicket of leaves that placed an increasing distance between us. The woods returned to a state of near primordial stillness. Hours passed. The light of morning thickened into an afternoon heat that covered my skin in sweat, then ebbed into the melting butter glow of twilight, then bled away, making way for night. I stayed where I was, listening to the stillness, to its interruption, the chaos of birds returning to the nest, to the returned stillness, deeper somehow, in the quiet after the noise, in the dark after the light. I heard the approach of thumping footsteps on the forest bed of dry leaves, a quick moment in the air before me, and then the weight of Saya settled right next to mine. Ruh was right, he said. You're still waiting for me. I shrugged. After a pause, he asked me, what do you want? What do you think I'm training for? I asked. He asked, but why do you want to do it? To be free, I said, and then corrected myself, to feel safe. Safe from what? He didn't ask. I'm like you, I didn't say. Our bodies spoke in our stead. He wrapped his hands around me and cradled me against his chest. And for the first time at the age of 18, I had a friend. Ruh commenced my training in sword fights. Lanterns winked off the edges of our painted cardboard swords as we leaped and turned midair and landed with our torsos leaning forward, our swords positioned on the neck of our opponent. This practice, he told me, would teach me how to use my hand during performances and how to optimize the use of the stage space. Then I learned the enactment of the 9 principal theatrical emotions: stony face of fury, eyes brimming with compassion, cheeks swollen with laughter, lips trembling in horror, parted in wonder, shriveled in disgust, chin stiffened with pride, head held high heroically, forehead creased with mercy, eyes twinkling with love. I approached them directly at first, mimicking an expression Ruh had, and then at a slant by applying it to a character. Sadness became Arjuna's sadness, disgust became Draupadi's disgust, horror became Brihannala's horror. Every morning I woke up and wore these expressions like they were prized ornaments. I started to enact characters in stories with arcs: male, female, young, old, god, demon, human, animal. I swam across these binaries like a fish moving from one river to another at the point of a confluence. Saya and Ruh took me to the tent of the chieftain early in August. Nandi, who was sitting cross-legged on a jute mat, reading from a palm leaf manuscript, looked up and regarded us with an unblinking gaze, not a trace of shock or anger on his face, as though it was perfectly normal for the boy he had dismissed and his 2 seasoned actors to turn up together in his tent. Give me any character I'll perform for you, I said. You're here, Nandi said. I apologized. I thought I'd angered him by following him despite his rejection. He shook his head. But you're here, he said again, slowly this time. His tone, its texture, was placid. And I see these 2, he said, pointing at Ruh and Saya. My actors, my beloveds, my kids, my terrible, terrible parents, my Krishna, my Bhima, my Sita, my Rama. Look at how they lean towards the prodigy. They want to hold you in their arms and carry you onto the stage this very second. He piled the manuscript pages into an oilcloth and continued. You think an audition will tell me anything about your ability to travel with us, share our beds, our makeup, our masks, cry with us, laugh with us, fight with us, be reduced to your rawest animal self? There is no question of pretense when we live together, day in, day out, and perform something so intense? Will an audition measure an actor's distance, actor's desire to slog through the worst of conditions, driven solely by a shared love for myth? It was growing dark. Nandi lit a kerosene lantern and turned its knob. A flame reared its head. In its light, I held his eyes and found a feeling of kinship. What story do you want to perform for your first show, he asked. Saya exclaimed, thank goodness I broke my back training your stupid face. Rue shrieked and clapped my back. He answered Nandi's question for me. Why, a sea elephant myth, of course. And slowly it sank in. So I'm going to read the last excerpt I have for you today, but just to complete the story that I started with. After Sabina said that this novel is dying to be a gay love story, and said that if Shagun decides to be gay, he'll find a community of friends to support him, I ended up going to therapy, and on the last day of a workshop which Sabina had as a potluck at her place, I came out in her workshop, which felt like a full circle. And so the running joke between Sabina and me often is that I took Sabina's workshop and had to go into therapy right away. And that's a story I tell often. And she said, I hope you're giving some context as to why that happened and how they connected. And I think what really helped me be where I am today is my found family. So in those of us who live our lives in the fringes, go out into the world and make our own family, our friends become our family, our community comes from sources that we find out in the world, people who feel a sense of kinship with us, with all of our oddities and strangenesses and othernesses. We form a community of outsiders, and I think when a community of outsiders becomes a community, they no longer are outsiders, right, because they have their own community. So a key theme for this novel became found family. And an idea that sort of was a consistent theme throughout is the desire to dismantle this structure of a heteronormative family where your partner is always at the top, followed by a biological family, followed by your friends and by your colleagues in order of importance. Rather, I think healthy queer relationships exist as a circle of community where your partner, your friends, your family, everyone, your family who chooses to accept you, all of you are equally important. And there is no privileging a partner over a friend because they're both equally dear to you. So I'm going to read a section from later on where Shagun and Mark, his boyfriend, they're temporarily separated, and there is a dangerous situation that our main character, Shagun, has to escape, and his friends help him. So Saya and Rue, who you already met, help him, as do some of the friends he makes along the way. This is from towards the end of the book. Over the last few months, I'd acquired a Ken doll, a retro outfit, and the Dravidian book of Seas and Stargazing, Volume 2. I packed them with my clothes in the bag I'd arrived with. The bed was stripped, the room empty, ready for the next occupant. When Sue came over, we took my bag to the balcony and sat on it. She pressed my head to her shoulder and let me cry. When she sensed the storm of grief had subsided for now, she let me go. What do you want, she asked, like from life? Saya had once asked me the same question. I want a celebration, I said. I want to perform something beautiful and intimate with Rue and with Saya. I want you to come see Mark and me running off into our bridal night. And I want my mom to be there too. I mean, why not if wishes were horses and all that? Run off into our bridal night, Sue mocked. You're such a drama queen. We laughed. You want a celebration? You'll get one. Sue walked with me up one floor. My students, all 8 of them, were in Nandi's room. So were the other members of my troupe. We commenced preparations to stage my escape from the cop. We traded our clothes for costumes. The room, like a green room, was lamplit. And in the light of those flames, the bowls of makeup resembled precious stones. Green like emerald, red like ruby, blue like lapis lazuli. The only movement was the hand of our makeup man, whose brush traced the contours of our faces, leaving in its wake trails of color, bright and viscous. Nandi started to sing a song, and Rue joined him, and then Saya joined him, and then I did. The makeup man's mouth twitched into a smile, even as his gaze was fixed on the faces our faces were becoming. Sue and my students listened to us, and every time we repeated the chorus, they hummed along. It was a song from the Hindu Romantic era, the Bhakti period, when art blurred the border between devotion and love, when a lover's home became your sacred address, and he, your lover, in all his fragile mortality, was no less a miracle than a god. Even after we stopped singing, we continued to hum, falling quiet one after the other. And so the silence that followed felt like a continuation of, rather than a punctuation to the song. We waited sitting upright on the bed, on the floor, our hands in our lap. And then we heard our cue, a trumpet, a drum, a ululation, a human throat producing a song that was in the register of birdsong. We filed down the stairs and exploded out the gate, the slow rhythm of our movement escalating into something rowdier, explosive almost. I was at the epicenter, dressed as Chitrangada, green blouse, green gown, surrounded by a wall of dancing bodies. Sue had my bag. From the corner of my eye, I saw my cup, a quick, blurred glimpse. 7 musicians surrounded us and drowned us in their music. In tandem, they blew their trumpets and struck the goatskin heads of their drums. We started to move like one body teeming with multiple heads and limbs. We left the alleyway and entered the school's main street. Then out we went, leaving the campus behind, onto Market Street. Along the way, people joined us. College students, shoppers with bags of produce, couples out on evening walks. The janta surrounded the musicians who surrounded us as we moved along. 3 winding streets later, we saw a parked minivan at one corner. The goodbyes began as we continued to move, as the musicians sustained their music at its crescendo, as strangers danced all around us. As I left that town where I met and lost the man I loved, I twirled in a circle from Nandi to Ruh to Saya to Sue. I gave them each a hug, pressed their bodies to mine, pressed my head to their necks and their shoulders. 3 rounds, 3 hugs for each of those humans whom I loved, and who by some crazy miracle had chosen to love me in return. The shoulder of my costume was smudged with their makeup. We slowed but didn't stop as our bodies surrounded the minivan, pushed against it, causing it to jolt back and forth. The driver stood open the back door, leaned his upper body out, and waved his fist at us. Sue slid the bag into the van. I crouched amid oppressive bodies and entered the van through the same open door. Nandi and Ruh towered over the rest as they pretended to argue with the driver. Lying flat, my stomach pressed to my back, I watched the face of Sue painted blue, of Saya painted green, the red of their eyes made redder against the surrounding palettes of color. Nandi struck the minivan with his fist, and the driver slipped his body back in and slid the door shut. Ruh and Nandi pressed their hands to the van's windows, and our eyes met. They were surrounded now by the people of the town. They were falling behind. They thumped the car once more with their palms, and then they were gone. I closed my eyes and listened to the music and their cries, relishing this oral contact until I heard a rap on the window. Wood and glass, the driver lowered his window. "This is no place to park," a stern voice said. I knew it was the cop. "Sorry, sir," the driver said. "I stopped for a cigarette and was about to go when they almost wiped me out." My eyes were closed. He started the engine, and just like that, we drove away. The procession was headed for the railway station, where my troop members would board the train and the rest would depart. And the cop would check them, as I knew he would. He wouldn't find me. The driver pulled to the side of the road. I changed out of my costume and into everyday clothes. With 2 bottles of water, I washed my makeup off. The driver took me to the Uttarkashi railway station. As I stood on the platform with my bag and watched my train pull in, I stuffed a hand into my trouser pocket and found a piece of paper. I fished it out. Written on it in Hindi, "This isn't goodbye," signed Nandi, Ruh, Saya. Mark had said those words to me in a different language. The resonance felt comforting. His promise, traveling through time, finding its place in Nandi's ink. I cried for all the tentative departures from my life, for the love that tentativeness contained. Thank you. I'll stop there.